Some wounds cut so deep they never heal, and Della May carried hers like stones in her heart. Every morning she woke to her mother's cruel words about her weight. Every evening she watched her father turn away in disappointment. In the small, frontier town of Bitterwell, her family saw her as nothing but shame. When a giant cowboy named Gage Morrison rode into town looking for help on his ranch, Della's parents made a deal. They would send their daughter away and finally be free of their burden. Gage was known as the Ox, a man who lived alone in the wilderness, feared by most and understood by none. But sometimes the people who seem the most frightening carry the gentlest hearts. What happens when two people the world has given up on find each other? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Bitterwell, Colorado Territory. In the autumn of 1882, the town sat like a forgotten afterthought in a valley between rolling hills, its weathered buildings testament to the hard lives of those who called it home. Della May Hutchins stood at the kitchen window of her family's cramped house on Elm Street, watching the world wake up beyond the cracked glass. Her fingers traced the worn spine of her grandmother's recipe book, the only thing of value she'd ever owned, filled with careful handwriting that spoke of love and warmth she'd never known. At 23, Della had learned to make herself small, to occupy as little space as possible in a world that constantly reminded her she took up too much. Her mother, Cordelia Hutchins, had perfected the art of cutting words that left invisible scars. Her father, Vernon, expressed his disappointment through silence so profound it felt like physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. Della May, her mother's voice sliced through the morning quiet like a blade. You best not be standing. They're daydreaming again. Breakfast won't make itself, and your father needs to get to the store. Della moved away from the window, her worn boots silent on the wooden floor. Years of trying to avoid attention had taught her to walk without sound, to exist without disturbance. She tied her faded apron around her waist, the fabric soft from countless washings, and began preparing the morning meal with practiced efficiency. The kitchen was her domain, the one place where her presence brought value rather than shame. Her hands moved with quiet confidence as she mixed batter for flapjacks, the recipe one she'd memorized from her grandmother's book. Grandmama had been different, the only person who'd ever looked at Della with kindness instead of judgment. When she'd passed 5 years ago, she'd left behind the recipe book and whispered words that Della still carried. You're worth more than they'll ever see, child. Don't let them make you believe otherwise. But believing those words proved harder than carrying them. Vernon Hutchins shuffled into the kitchen, his thin frame draped in the same work clothes he'd worn for years. He owned the general store on Main Street, a modest business that kept the family fed but never comfortable. His eyes skittered away from Della, as they always did, unable to meet the gaze of the daughter who embarrassed him simply by existing. Coffee. Ready? He asked the heir, rather than addressing her directly. Yes, Papa. Della poured the dark liquid into his chipped mug, careful not to let their fingers touch. Even accidental contact seemed to pain him. Cordelia swept into the kitchen like a storm gathering strength. Tall and sharp-featured, she'd once been considered pretty in a harsh, unforgiving way. Now, at 45, bitterness had carved deep lines around her eyes and mouth. She surveyed the breakfast preparations with the critical eye of someone perpetually dissatisfied. I don't know why you insist on making so many flapjacks, she said, settling into her chair at the small table. It's not as if we need the extra food around here. Her gaze pointedly traveled over Della's fuller figure, the daily ritual of shame beginning anew. Della's hands stilled for just a moment over the griddle before resuming their steady work. She'd learned not to respond to such comments, understanding that engagement only invited more cruelty. Instead, she focused on the simple pleasure of cooking, the way flour and eggs and milk transformed into something nourishing and warm. The recipe book lay open beside the stove, its pages yellowed with age and spotted with ingredients from years of use. Grandmama's careful script filled every margin with notes and variations, small hearts drawn next to the recipes that brought the most joy. Looking at it now, Della could almost hear her grandmother's gentle voice. Cooking is love made. Visible, sweetheart. Don't ever forget that. Outside, the town was coming to life. Mrs. Pemberton, the kindly widow who lived next door, was hanging wash on her line. She always offered Della a smile and a wave when their paths crossed. One of the few people who seemed to see her as human rather than burden. The blacksmith was already at work, the sound of his hammer ringing across the morning air. Children ran past the window on their way to the schoolhouse, their laughter bright and carefree. Della served breakfast in silence, placing plates before her parents with the careful precision of someone who'd learned that even the smallest mistake could trigger harsh words. She took her own smaller portion and sat at the far end of the table, making herself as unobtrusive as possible. "Mrs. Anderson mentioned seeing you talking to her boy yesterday," Cordelia said suddenly, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. "I hope you're not getting ideas above your station. That family has standards." Heat flooded Della's cheeks. She'd simply helped young Timothy Anderson when he'd dropped his school books in the street, but even kindness was suspect when it came from her. "I was just helping him, Mama. Nothing more. See that it stays that way." Cordelia's fork clinked against her plate with unnecessary force. "The last thing this family needs is you embarrassing us further with foolish notions." Vernon cleared his throat uncomfortably, but said nothing in his daughter's defense. His silence spoke volumes, a daily reminder that even her own father found her presence shameful. After breakfast, Della cleared the table and washed the dishes with methodical care. Each plate, each cup, each piece of cutlery received her full attention, partly from habit, partly because focusing on simple tasks helped quiet the pain that lived constantly beneath her ribs. The warm, soapy water felt good on her hands, and for a few moments she could pretend she was anywhere else. Through the kitchen window, she watched the town's daily rhythms unfold. Old Mr. Garrett led his horses to water. The postmaster sorted mail on the steps of his office. Normal people living normal lives, unmarked by the particular shame that seemed to cling to her like morning fog. "I'll be at the store," Vernon announced, reaching for his hat. "Don't expect me back until evening. We're waiting on a freight delivery." He left without looking at either woman, but Della caught the relief in his posture as he escaped the uncomfortable atmosphere of his own home. Even her father preferred the company of strangers to sitting in the same room with her. Cordelia rose from the table with a dramatic sigh. "I suppose I should call on Mrs. Henley this morning. Her daughter's engagement. Has the whole town talking?" She paused at the doorway, her gaze settling on Della with familiar disdain. "Try not to make a spectacle of yourself while I'm gone. The last thing I need is more talk about this family." And then Della was alone, surrounded by the silence that had become her closest companion. She finished the dishes and wiped down the table, then stood uncertainly in the middle of the kitchen. The day stretched ahead, with no purpose beyond existing as quietly as possible. She picked up her grandmother's recipe book and held it close, breathing in the faint scent of vanilla and cinnamon that still clung to its pages. Here was love, preserved, in careful handwriting, in notes about which spices worked best together, in the gentle reminder that food was meant to nourish both body and soul. The sound of horses approaching drew her attention back to the window. A small crowd was gathering. Near the saloon, voices raised in excitement or concern. Della watched from her safe distance as men pointed and gestured, their conversation too distant to understand. Then she saw him. The man, dismounting from the largest horse she'd ever seen, stood nearly 7 feet tall, his shoulders broad enough to block out the sun. Even from across the street, his presence seemed to command attention and respect in equal measure. This had to be the mysterious Gage Morrison, the man the townspeople whispered about in hushed tones, equal parts fear and fascination in their voices. Della had heard the stories. How he lived alone on a ranch 20 miles from town. How he rarely spoke to anyone during his infrequent visits for supplies. How his mere presence could quiet a room full of rowdy cowboys. Some said he'd killed men with his bare hands. Others claimed he could track a whisper across stone. All agreed that crossing Gage, the ox Morrison, was a mistake no one made twice. But watching him now, Della saw something the storytellers missed. The way he moved with careful control, as if conscious of his size and its effect on others. The gentle manner in which he handled his horse, running a hand along its neck in what looked like affection. The respectful nod he offered to Mrs. Patterson when she hurried past with obvious nervousness. Perhaps it was her lifetime of being judged by appearances that made her look deeper, but Della sensed something familiar in the big man's careful isolation, the way he held himself apart from the crowd, the practiced distance that kept others from getting too close. She recognized it because she lived it every day, the protective shell that developed around people who'd been hurt too often. "Afternoon, Morrison." Sheriff Talbot approached with the cautious respect reserved for dangerous men who stayed on the right side of the law. "What brings you to town?" Gage's voice carried across the street, deep and measured. "Need to hire help for the ranch, someone who can manage a household." The sheriff's eyebrows rose. "That's a change. Thought you preferred the solitary life." "Ranch is getting too big for one man to handle everything." Gage's explanation was brief, offering no glimpse into his private thoughts. Word spread quickly through the small town. Gage Morrison was looking for a housekeeper. The position would mean living on his remote ranch, 20 miles from civilization, working for a man whose reputation inspired more fear than confidence. It wasn't the kind of opportunity that would attract many applicants. Della watched the scene unfold with growing fascination. Here was a man even more isolated than herself, someone who'd chosen solitude rather than having it forced upon him. What circumstances had driven him to such complete separation from human society? What secrets lived behind those careful, measured words? She was still wondering when her mother returned from her social call, cheeks flushed with excitement, and something that looked dangerously like opportunity. "Della May!" Cordelia called from the front door, her voice carrying an unfamiliar lightness. "Come here. We need to discuss something important." The tone made Della's stomach clench with foreboding. Her mother only sounded pleasant when she was planning something unpleasant for someone else. She set down the recipe book and made her way to the front room, where Cordelia stood removing her bonnet with hands that trembled slightly with excitement. "I've just had the most interesting conversation with Mrs. Henley," her mother began, her eyes bright with possibilities Della couldn't yet fathom. "It seems that big cowboy, Morrison, is looking for household help, live-in position, good pay." Della waited, sensing the trap but not yet understanding its shape. "Of course, most decent women wouldn't consider such an arrangement," Cordelia continued, hanging her bonnet on its hook with deliberate care. "Living alone with a man of his reputation. But then again, you're not most women, are you, dear?" The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Her mother wasn't discussing an opportunity, she was discussing a disposal method, a way to rid the family of its embarrassing burden, while possibly earning some money in the process. "Mama," Della began, but Cordelia cut her off with a raised hand. "Don't interrupt. This could be exactly what this family needs, what you need, a chance to make yourself useful while giving your father and me the peace we deserve," she began, pacing the small room, her mind clearly racing ahead to the benefits of such an arrangement. "Yes, the more I think about it, the more perfect it seems." Della felt the familiar crushing weight of being unwanted. But this time, it carried the added horror of being actively discarded. She thought of her grandmother's recipe book, of the small garden she tended behind the house, of Mrs. Pemberton's kind smiles. These were the only connections to happiness she'd ever known, and now they would be severed for her parents' convenience. "I won't go," she said quietly, surprised by her own courage. Cordelia stopped pacing and turned to stare at her daughter with genuine amazement. "Excuse me, I said I won't go." Della's voice grew stronger with repetition. "This is my home too. I have a right to stay." For a moment, mother and daughter faced each other across a chasm of hurt and disappointment that had been years in the making. Then Cordelia's expression hardened into something cruel and final. "You have no rights in this house, girl. You're a burden we've carried long enough out of Christian charity and family obligation. If Gage Morrison is willing to pay good money for your services, then by God, you'll provide them." The words hit like physical blows, but beneath the pain, something else stirred in Della's chest. A small flame of defiance that had been smothering for years suddenly found oxygen. Maybe it was the thought of her grandmother's disappointed face. Maybe it was the realization that things literally could not get worse. Or maybe it was simply the understanding that even unwanted people deserved basic human dignity. But before she could voice her growing rebellion, the front door opened and Vernon stepped inside, his face grave with the weight of whatever decision he'd already made. "I've spoken with Morrison," he announced without preamble. "He's agreed to the arrangement. Della will leave with him tomorrow morning." The trap snapped shut with the finality of her father's words, and Della understood that her childhood, such as it had been, was over. Tomorrow she would begin a new life with a stranger whose reputation terrified an entire town. But perhaps, she thought, with the desperate hope of someone with no other choice, even the unknown had to be better than the familiar cruelty of home. The morning air carried the bite of approaching winter as Della May stood in the doorway of the only home she'd ever known, clutching her grandmother's recipe book against her chest like armor. Her few belongings, 2 dresses, a worn shawl, some undergarments, and a small wooden box containing her mother's discarded jewelry, fit easily into the battered carpet bag at her feet. 23 years of existence reduced to what could be carried in one hand. Gage Morrison sat atop his massive horse in the street, waiting with the patience of a man accustomed to solitude. In the early light, he looked even more imposing than he had yesterday, his broad shoulders outlined against the pale sky. His dark eyes surveyed the scene with careful neutrality, revealing nothing of his thoughts about the transaction taking place. Vernon Hutchins emerged from the house, carrying a folded piece of paper, the hastily written contract he'd drawn up the night before. The document spelled out the terms in Vernon's careful merchant script. Della would work as housekeeper and cook on Morrison's ranch in exchange for room, board, and $20 monthly wages. Half of those wages would be sent directly to her family as compensation for her upbringing and care. The arrangement could be terminated by either party with 2 weeks' notice. What the contract didn't mention was that Della had never been asked if she agreed to its terms. "Here's the agreement we discussed," Vernon said, approaching the mounted cowboy with the nervous deference of a small man dealing with someone who could break him in half. "Everything as we settled on." Gage took the paper and read it with deliberate care, his weathered face showing no emotion. "This says she gets $10 a month after you take your cut. That's correct. Seems fair compensation, considering our investment in raising her." "Investment." Gage repeated the word as if testing its flavor. His gaze shifted from the paper to Vernon, then to Della, standing frozen in the doorway. "And she agreed to this arrangement." The question hung in the morning air like smoke from a gun barrel. Vernon's jaw tightened, clearly not expecting his authority to be questioned. "She's my daughter. I make decisions regarding her welfare. She's also a grown woman." Gage folded the contract and tucked it into his shirt pocket. "Seems like she should have some say in the matter." Cordelia appeared beside her husband, her face sharp with irritation at the unexpected complication. "Mr. Morrison, I assure you Della is grateful for this opportunity. Aren't you, dear?" Her voice carried a warning that Della recognized from years of careful navigation around her mother's temper. All eyes turned to Della, and for a moment she felt the terrible weight of choice settling on her shoulders. she could refuse, stand in this doorway and declare her right to determine her own fate. But what then? Her parents had made their feelings clear. Even if she stayed, nothing would change except the daily burden of knowing she remained where she wasn't wanted. The alternative was the unknown, a remote ranch, a man whose reputation inspired fear, work that might prove beyond her capabilities. But also, and this thought surprised her with its power, escape from the constant reminder of her inadequacy, a chance to discover who she might become away from the mirror of her parents' disappointment. "I'll go," she said quietly, her voice barely audible in the morning stillness. Gage nodded once, as if this settled the matter, but his eyes remained on her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "You understand this means living 20 miles from town, no neighbors nearby. It's a hard life and lonely." "I understand." She did understand, perhaps better than he realized. Loneliness was nothing new to her. At least, this loneliness would come without the daily reminder of how she'd failed to meet others' expectations. Good. Gage dismounted with fluid grace despite his size, his boots hitting the dusty street with solid authority. "We'll need to get supplies before heading out. The ride to the ranch takes most of a day." Vernon stepped forward, eager to complete the transaction before any other complications arose. "About the wages. $20 a month to her," Gage interrupted, his tone carrying quiet finality. "Full amount. If you want compensation for raising your daughter, take it up with someone. Who gives a damn about your financial problems?" The words fell like hammer blows, and Della saw her father's face flush red with humiliation and anger. But Vernon was smart enough not to challenge a man who could crush him without effort. He swallowed his pride, along with his objections, and managed a stiff nod. Cordelia's mouth opened as if to protest, then snapped shut when Gage's attention turned to her. Something in his steady gaze warned against argument. "I'll wait while you say your goodbyes," Gage told Della, stepping back to give the family privacy for their parting. Della looked at her parents, searching for some sign of regret or affection in their faces. Her father avoided her eyes, as always, studying his boots as if they contained fascinating secrets. Her mother's expression was carefully blank, already practicing the face she'd wear when neighbors asked about her daughter's sudden departure. "Well," Cordelia said briskly, "I suppose this is it then. No embrace, no blessing, no tears or promises to write. Just the practical acknowledgement that a problem was being solved. Goodbye, Mama. Papa." Della picked up her carpet bag. Its weight, somehow both insignificant and crushing. Everything she was taking from her old life fit in one small bag. Everything she was leaving behind, the garden she'd tended, Mrs. Pemberton's kind smiles, the kitchen where she'd found her only moments of peace, would continue without her, as if she'd never existed. Mrs. Pemberton appeared at her front gate, her lined face creased with genuine sorrow. She'd obviously been watching from her window, waiting for this moment. "You take care of yourself, dear girl," she called softly. "Remember that you're worth more than they've let you believe." The kindness in her neighbor's voice nearly undid Della's careful composure. She managed a grateful nod before turning away, afraid that if she spoke, she might break down entirely. Gage helped her up onto the wagon seat with surprising gentleness, his large hands careful not to grip too tightly. The simple courtesy, being assisted rather than ignored or criticized, felt foreign and strangely welcome. "Ready?" he asked, settling beside her and taking up the reins. Della nodded, not trusting her voice. As the wagon began to move, she resisted the urge to look back at the house on Elm Street. That part of her life was over, and dwelling on it would only make the unknown future seem more frightening. They rode in silence through the waking town, past the general store where her father would spend his day pretending he hadn't just sold his daughter's services to a stranger, past the church where her mother would sit on Sunday playing the part of a respectable woman despite what she'd done, past the schoolhouse and the blacksmith shop and all the other ordinary places where ordinary people lived ordinary lives. As they reached the edge of Bitter Well, Gage finally spoke. You afraid? The directness of the question caught her off. A guard. She considered lying, giving the expected answer that would smooth over any awkwardness. But something in his tone suggested he valued honesty over politeness. Yes, she admitted. But not of you. He glanced at her with surprise. No, most people are. I'm afraid of failing, of being unable to do the work you need done, of proving once again that I'm not worth the trouble. The words spilled out before she could stop them. Raw honesty, born from having nothing left to lose. Gage was quiet for a long moment, his attention seemingly focused on the road ahead. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a gentleness she hadn't expected. Fear's not always a bad thing, keeps us careful, but don't let other people's opinions become your truth. He paused, then added quietly, I know something about being judged for things you can't control. The wagon rolled on through the Colorado morning, carrying them away from the familiar cruelty of Bitter Well toward whatever waited at Gage Morrison's remote ranch. Behind them, smoke rose from breakfast fires as the town continued its daily routine, largely indifferent to the departure of its most unwanted resident. Della held her grandmother's recipe book a little tighter and tried to imagine a future where she might be valued for her contributions rather than scorned for her existence. It seemed impossible, but then again, 24 hours ago, she couldn't have imagined leaving home at all. Perhaps the impossible was simply another word for the unknown, waiting to be discovered one careful step at a time. The wagon rolled through countryside that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, broken only by occasional stands of aspen trees whose golden leaves caught the morning light like scattered coins. Della had never traveled so far from Bitter. And the vastness of the landscape both thrilled and intimidated her. Here was a world without the confining walls of her parents' disappointment, where the horizon promised possibilities she'd never dared imagine. Gage drove with the easy competence of someone who'd traveled these roads countless times. His worn leather gloves handled the reins with practiced gentleness, never jerking or forcing the horses, but guiding them with subtle pressure that spoke of deep understanding between man and animal. Everything about his manner suggested careful control, as if he was constantly aware of his size and strength and their potential to cause harm. They'd been riding for nearly 2 hours when Gage pulled the wagon to a halt beside a small creek that wound through a grove of cottonwoods. The horses immediately moved toward the water, grateful for the chance to drink after their steady work. "We'll rest here," Gage said, climbing down from the wagon seat. "Horses need water, and you probably need to stretch your legs." He moved around to her side of the wagon and extended his hand to help her down. Della hesitated for just a moment. Physical contact with men was something her mother had always warned against with particular vehemence, but his expression was patient and entirely respectful. She placed her hand in his, surprised by how carefully he assisted her, ensuring she was steady on her feet before releasing her. "Thank you," she said softly, then immediately felt foolish for thanking him for simple courtesy. But kindness was so foreign to her experience that even small gestures seemed worthy of gratitude. While the horses drank and rested, Della walked to the creek's edge and knelt to splash cool water on her face and hands. The silence out here was different from the oppressive quiet of her parents' house. This was the peaceful silence of open spaces, filled with the gentle sounds of wind through leaves and water over stones. "Beautiful country," she ventured, glancing back at Gage, who was checking the horses' harnesses with methodical thoroughness. "Gets lonely," he replied without looking up. "Miles between neighbors, weeks sometimes without seeing another soul. Does that bother you?" He paused in his work and considered her question with the same careful attention he seemed to give everything. "Used to think I preferred it that way. Now I'm not so sure." Something in his tone suggested layers of meaning she didn't yet understand. But before she could ask for clarification, he was moving again, preparing to resume their journey. The afternoon sun climbed higher as they continued west, and Della found herself studying her companion with growing curiosity. Despite his intimidating reputation, everything she'd observed suggested a man of unusual thoughtfulness. He'd modified his pace to account for her comfort, stopping regularly to rest the horses and offer her water from his canteen. When they'd passed a family of deer at the forest's edge, she'd caught him watching them with something almost like tenderness. "May I ask you something?" she said during one of their comfortable silences. "Go ahead. Why did you need a housekeeper? You seem quite capable of managing on your own." Gage was quiet for so long, she began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if he was still deciding how much truth to reveal. "Ranch has grown beyond what one person can handle properly. Cattle need tending. But so does everything else. House, meals, mending, cleaning, all the work that keeps a place from falling into ruin." He paused, then added more quietly, "Gets hard to remember why you're working so hard when there's no one to share it with." The admission surprised her with its honesty. Here was a man admitting to loneliness, something her own father would never have acknowledged even if it killed him. "I can do those things," she said simply. "Housework, I mean. Cooking, cleaning, mending. My grandmother taught me to make everything from scratch, and I've been managing my parents' household for years." "Your grandmother sounds like she was important to you." The observation was gentle but perceptive, and Della felt her throat tighten with sudden emotion. "She was the only person who ever made me feel like I mattered. When she died, it was like losing the only light in a very dark room." Gage nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I understand that kind of loss." Something in his voice suggested he spoke from experience, but before she could ask what he meant, he was pointing ahead to where the road crested a low hill. "Ranch is just beyond that ridge," he said. "Home." As they topped the hill, Della got her first view of what would be her new life. The Morrison Ranch spread across a broad valley like something from a picture book, green pastures dotted with cattle stretching toward distant mountains. The house itself was larger than she'd expected, a sturdy log structure with a wide front porch and stone chimney, surrounded by well-tended outbuildings and corrals. Everything spoke of prosperity and care, the kind of place that would require substantial work to maintain, but would reward that effort with beauty and comfort. "It's wonderful," she breathed, meaning every word. After the cramped confines of her parents' house, the ranch looked like a palace of possibilities. "Needs work," Gage said practically, but she caught the note of pride in his voice. "House has been empty too long, dust everywhere, pantry bare, garden overgrown. Going to be a big job getting everything back in order." "I'm not afraid of work," Della assured him, and realized as she said it that this was completely true. Work had always been her refuge from her parents' criticism, the one area where she felt competent and valued. The prospect of having a whole household to manage, properly manage, without constant criticism and complaint, actually excited her. They descended into the valley as the sun began to sink toward the western peaks. The ranch grew more impressive the closer they got, revealing details that spoke of both prosperity and careful attention. The fences were in good repair. The barn looked solid and well-maintained, and the cattle in the near pasture appeared healthy and well-fed. But it was the garden that caught Della's attention and held it. Even neglected and overgrown, she could see the bones of what had once been a magnificent vegetable and herb garden. Tomato plants climbed broken stakes, their late fruit hanging heavy and red. Pumpkins sprawled across unmown grass, their orange globes bright in the fading light. Herbs had gone wild, but still scented the air with sage and thyme and rosemary. "Someone put a lot of love into that garden," she observed. Gage's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the reins. "My wife. She had a way with growing things." Had. Past tense. Della filed that information away with growing understanding. Here was another piece of the puzzle that was Gage Morrison, a man who lived alone on a ranch, clearly built for a family, surrounded by the remnants of someone else's dreams. They pulled up in front of the house as the last light faded from the Western sky. Gage helped her down from the wagon with the same careful courtesy he'd shown all day, then began unloading her meager belongings. "I'll show you around tomorrow in daylight," he said, carrying her carpet bag toward the front door. "Tonight we'll just get you settled and fed." The house was indeed dusty and neglected, but it was also spacious and well-built, with large windows and comfortable furnishings that spoke of someone who'd once taken pride in creating a home. Gage lit several lamps, filling the main room with warm, golden light that revealed the full extent of what would be her domain. "Your room is upstairs," he said, leading the way up a sturdy wooden staircase. "Has its own window and everything you should need." The room he showed her was larger than her parents' entire kitchen, with a comfortable bed, a washstand, and a chest of drawers for her few possessions. Most importantly, it had a lock on the inside of the door, a courtesy that told her more about Gage's character than any number of reassuring words. "I'll leave you to get settled," he said, setting her bag down near the bed. "There's cold beef and bread in the kitchen when you're ready to eat. Tomorrow we'll start figuring out how to make this work." After he left, closing the door quietly. Behind him, Della sat on the edge of the bed and looked around her new room. For the first time in her adult life, she had a space that was entirely her own, where no one would criticize or belittle or ignore her. The silence here was peaceful rather than oppressive, filled with possibility rather than judgment. She unpacked her few belongings with careful reverence, placing her grandmother's recipe book on the small table by the window where morning light would fall across its pages. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and uncertainties, but tonight she was simply grateful for this unexpected sanctuary, and for the quiet giant downstairs who treated her with more courtesy in one day than her own family had managed in 23 years. Della woke to sunlight streaming through her window and the sound of cattle lowing in the distance. For a moment, disorientation gripped her. This wasn't her cramped room at home with its cracked ceiling and her mother's voice already sharp with morning complaints. This was her room, in a house where she had purpose and value, where yesterday she'd been treated with more respect than she'd known in years. She dressed quickly in her work dress and made her way downstairs to find that Gage had already been up for hours. Through the kitchen window, she could see him working with a horse in the corral, his movements patient and sure. Coffee had been made and left warming on the stove, a small kindness that told her he'd thought of her comfort even while going. About his own morning routine, the kitchen was spacious and well-equipped, though clearly neglected. Dust coated every surface, and the pantry revealed shelves mostly bare except for basic staples: flour, dried beans, coffee, and little else. It was the kitchen of a man who'd been merely surviving rather than living, eating to fuel his body, rather than nourish his soul. Della rolled up her sleeves and set to work with the systematic thoroughness her grandmother had taught her. First, she cleaned every surface until it gleamed, organizing the sparse supplies and making mental notes of what would be needed from town. Then she began breakfast, working with the familiar rhythm that had always brought her peace. By the time Gage came in from his morning chores, the kitchen had been transformed. Clean surfaces reflected the morning light, and the air was filled with the scents of frying bacon, fresh coffee, and biscuits golden brown from the oven. He stopped in the doorway, his expression unreadable as he took in the changes. "Smells. And good," he said simply, but Della caught the note of surprise in his voice, as if he'd forgotten what a properly managed kitchen could offer. "I hope you're hungry," she replied, placing a plate of food before him that was nothing like the sparse, functional meals he'd probably grown accustomed to. The biscuits were light and flaky, the bacon crisp but not burnt, the eggs cooked exactly right. It was food prepared with care and attention, the kind of meal that said someone had taken time to consider his comfort and satisfaction. Gage ate with the careful appreciation of someone who'd learned not to take good food for granted. "This is excellent," he said after several bites. "Been a long time since I've had biscuits this good." The simple praise warmed Della more than elaborate compliments might have. Here was someone who noticed and valued her efforts, who saw her work as contribution rather than obligation. "I found your wife's garden," she said carefully, watching his reaction. "With your permission, I'd like to try bringing it back. There's still time to save some of the plants for winter storage." Gage's fork paused halfway to his mouth, and for a moment his face showed the pain he usually kept carefully hidden. "Haven't been able to bring myself to touch it," he admitted quietly. "Seemed wrong somehow, changing what she'd built." "I wouldn't change it," Della assured him. "Just tend what's already there. Honor what she started." He studied her face with that careful attention she was beginning to recognize as characteristic. "You understand about loss." It wasn't a question, and she didn't treat it as one. "Loss is what taught me to value the good things when I find them." After breakfast, Gage showed her around the ranch property with the pride of someone who'd built something lasting with his own hands. The barn was solid and well-organized, the corrals sturdy and functional. Everything spoke of competence and care, of a man who took responsibility for what was his and executed it well. "This is beautiful," Della said as they walked past a small pasture where horses grazed peacefully. "You've built something wonderful here." "Wasn't just me," Gage replied, then seemed to catch himself. "I mean, took a lot of work, still does." But Della had heard what he'd almost said, and she understood. This ranch had been built for a family, designed by someone who'd expected to share its beauty and prosperity. Now it was maintained by a man going through the motions of life without its joy. That afternoon, while Gage worked with the cattle, Della began her assault on the neglected house. Room by room, she cleaned and organized, discovering as she worked that this had once been a true home, rather than just a shelter. There were books in the sitting room, good china in the dining room cabinet, and everywhere the touches of someone who'd cared about creating beauty as well as function. It was while cleaning Gage's study that she found the photograph. The small silver frame had been face down in a desk drawer, buried beneath papers and forgotten. Della's intention had been simply to organize the chaos, but when she lifted the frame to dust beneath it, the photograph inside caught her attention and held it. The woman in the picture was lovely in a gentle, understated way, with kind eyes, and a smile that spoke of deep contentment. She held a small child, a boy, perhaps 3 or 4 years old, who had his father's dark hair and serious expression. But what struck Della most was the look on Gage's face as he stood behind them, his massive hands resting gently on his wife's shoulders. Here was a man transformed by love, his harsh features softened by happiness and pride, and the kind of complete contentment that came from having found his place in the world. The contrast between that man and the careful, isolated figure she'd come to know was heartbreaking in its completeness. Whatever had happened to this family had taken more than lives. It had taken Gage's ability to believe he deserved happiness. She was still staring at the photograph when footsteps on the stairs announced his return. Della quickly set the frame back in its drawer, but not quickly enough. Gage appeared in the doorway just as she was closing it, and his eyes went immediately to her guilty expression. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I was just cleaning, organizing the papers, and I didn't mean to—" "You saw it." His voice was flat, carefully empty of emotion. "Yes, there was no point in lying. They were beautiful. Your family." Gage moved into the room and pulled open the drawer, lifting out the photograph with hands that trembled slightly. For a long moment he stared at it, his face a map of pain so deep it seemed to define him. "Caroline and Thomas," he said finally. "My wife and son." The past tense hung between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Della waited, sensing that pushing for details would shut him down completely. "Fever took them," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. 3 years ago, come winter. 1 week they were fine, laughing and planning Christmas. The next week I was burying them both." Della felt tears sting her eyes, not just for his loss, but for the man he'd become because of it. "I'm so sorry." "Built this place for them, for the life we were going to have together." He set the photograph back in the drawer, but didn't close it this time. Sometimes I wonder why I keep it going. What's the point of all this without someone to share it with? The question hung in the air between them, and Della found herself wanting to tell him that sharing didn't always require blood relations or marriage vows. Sometimes it was as simple as someone caring whether you ate well, or noticed when you'd worked hard, or understood that everyone deserved to have their contributions valued. But those were dangerous thoughts for a woman in her position, so she simply said, "They would want you to be happy. People who love us don't want our lives to end when theirs do." Gage looked at her with surprise, as if the thought had never occurred to him. "You think? I know. My grandmother told me once that the best way to honor someone's memory is to keep living the kind of life that would have made them proud." For the first time since she'd met him, Gage smiled. Not the careful, controlled expression he usually wore, but something genuine and warm. "Caroline would have liked you," he said. "She always said the measure of a person wasn't what they'd been given, but what they did with it." As evening fell and they shared another of Della's carefully prepared meals, she found herself thinking about second chances and the strange ways that broken people sometimes found each other. Neither of them was what they'd once expected to become, but perhaps that didn't matter. Perhaps what mattered was recognizing when someone saw past your scars to the person you were trying to become. Looking across the table at Gage's face, relaxed, in the lamplight and free for once of its habitual wariness, Della dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd finally found a place where she belonged. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that surprised Della with its contentment. She woke each morning to the sound of Gage moving quietly about his early chores, always careful not to disturb her rest. By the time she came downstairs, he'd have coffee ready and would offer a respectful "morning, Miss Della," that made her feel valued rather than tolerated. Their conversations over breakfast grew longer and more comfortable, touching on ranch business, weather, and the small observations that people share when they're learning to trust each other. It was during one of her afternoon walks around the property that Della discovered the grave. She'd been exploring the area beyond the main house, familiarizing herself with the boundaries of her new world, when she came upon a small rise overlooking the valley. There, beneath a spreading oak tree, were two simple wooden crosses marking freshly tended plots. Even before she read the careful lettering burned into the wood, she knew what she'd found. Caroline Morrison, beloved wife and mother, 1856-1879. Thomas Morrison, precious son, 1876-1879. The crosses were crude but lovingly made, carved by hands more familiar with ranch work than fine carpentry. But it was the care evident in the sight itself that brought tears to Della's eyes. Someone had been maintaining this place with devoted attention. The grass was trimmed, wildflowers had been planted around the borders, and small stones spelled "Out together always" between the two graves. Gage had been coming here regularly, tending this sacred space with the same dedication he brought to everything else on the ranch. The realization made her understand his careful isolation with new clarity. This wasn't a man who'd chosen solitude. This was someone who'd had love ripped away so completely that he'd forgotten how to believe it could exist again. Figured you'd find it eventually. Della turned to find Gage standing at the edge of the clearing, his hat in his hands and his expression unreadable. She hadn't heard him approach, but then again he moved with surprising quiet for such a large man. "I'm sorry," she said automatically. "I didn't mean to intrude." "Not intruding. It's not a secret." He moved to stand beside her, his eyes fixed on the crosses. "Come here every few days. Keep it neat. Talk to them sometimes, though I suppose that makes me seem touched in the head." "It makes you seem human," Della replied gently. "Love doesn't end just because life does." They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, two people who understood loss in their different ways. Finally, Gage spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of memories too heavy to bear alone. "Thomas was just starting to talk real good when the fever came. Caroline was teaching him his letters, said he was going to be smart like his mama." His hands tightened on his hat brim. She held him even when she was burning up with fever herself. Couldn't bear to let him be scared and alone. Della felt her throat close with sympathy for the woman who'd faced death while trying to comfort her child, and for the man who'd had to watch helplessly as his world ended. They died within hours of each other, Gage continued. Maybe that was a mercy. Neither had to live without the other. Left me wondering why I was the one who got left behind. The raw honesty of his words hit Della like a physical blow. She recognized that particular pain, the bewilderment of survival, the guilt of continuing to breathe when others couldn't. She'd felt it when her grandmother died, leaving her alone with people who saw her as a burden. Sometimes the people who get left behind are meant to do something important, she said softly. Maybe we don't know what it is right away, but that doesn't mean it's not there. Gage looked at her with surprise, as if he'd never considered that his survival might have purpose beyond mere endurance. What makes you think that? Because you built something beautiful here. Because you take care of things. The animals, the land, this place where they rest. Because you saw someone who needed help and offered it even when you didn't have to. You mean taking you in? He shook his head. That wasn't charity. I needed the help. You could have hired anyone, but you chose someone your whole town was eager to get rid of, someone other people saw as worthless. Della's voice grew stronger as she spoke, fueled by a growing understanding. Maybe you recognize something familiar. The words hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to examine fully, but the truth was there. Visible. In the careful way they'd been learning to see each other, two people the world had written off, finding unexpected value in what others had discarded. Caroline always said everything happened for a reason, Gage said eventually. Even the hard things, especially the hard things. She sounds like she was wise. Wiser than me. She would have known what to do with all this. He gestured around. The property. But Della understood he meant more than just the ranch. He meant the overwhelming responsibility of continuing to live when the reason for living was gone. As they walked back toward the house together, Della found herself thinking about the strange ways that broken people sometimes found each other. Neither of them was what they'd originally expected to become, but perhaps that was exactly why they could understand each other so clearly. They both knew what it meant to lose the thing that defined you and have to figure out how to keep going. Anyway, that evening, as she prepared dinner in the kitchen that was becoming truly hers, Della heard unfamiliar sounds outside. Voices, horses, the creak of wagon wheels. She looked out the window to see three rough-looking men dismounting near the corral, their attention focused on the horses with the calculating interest of people evaluating potential theft. Gage emerged. From the barn, and even from a distance, she could see the tension in his posture. These weren't friends or neighbors. This was trouble. She moved closer to the window, straining to hear the conversation. The men were asking about cattle, about how many head Gage was running, about whether he had help managing such a large operation. Their questions sounded innocent enough, but their eyes moved constantly, cataloguing everything they saw with professional assessment. "Just passing through," one of them was saying. "Heard you had good stock. Thought you might be interested in selling some head." But Della had grown up in a frontier town. She knew the difference between legitimate cattle buyers and men looking for easy targets. These visitors weren't interested in purchasing anything. They were scouting, gathering information for later use. When they finally rode away after declining Gage's offer of supper and a place to sleep, he stood watching them until they disappeared. Over the ridge. Only then did he come inside, his face grim with concern. "Trouble?" Della asked, though she already knew the answer. "Maybe, probably." He moved to the window and checked the latch, then did the same with the door. Those men weren't cattle buyers. They were mapping the place, counting stock, looking for weaknesses. Rustlers, most likely. There's been talk in town about missing cattle, ranchers finding their herds smaller than they should be. He turned to face her, his expression serious. "Della, this might get dangerous. If you want to go back to town, no. The word came out sharper than she'd intended, surprising them both. I mean, if there's going to be trouble, you'll need help. I'm not running away at the first sign of difficulty. Gage studied her face with that careful attention she'd come to value. This isn't your fight, isn't it? She met his gaze steadily. This is my home now, too. I'm not letting anyone take it without a fight. Something shifted in Gage's expression. Surprise, giving way to what looked like respect, and perhaps something deeper. For the first time since she'd known him, he looked at her not as someone who needed protection, but as someone who might stand beside him against whatever was coming. In that case, he said quietly, we'd better start preparing for war. 3 weeks had passed since the suspicious visitors, and the autumn air carried the crisp promise of winter. Della had settled into ranch life with a contentment she'd never thought possible, finding purpose in every task from tending the recovered garden to managing the household accounts that Gage had gradually turned over to her capable hands. The rhythm of their days had become comfortable, marked by shared meals, easy conversation, and the growing understanding that comes when two solitary people discover they work well together. It was on a Tuesday morning, while Della was hanging wash on the line behind the house, that she saw Gage returning from town earlier than expected. Even from a distance, she could tell something was different about his posture. There was an excitement in his movements that she hadn't seen before. He dismounted near the porch and called to her, his voice carrying a note of something she couldn't quite identify. Della, could you come here for a moment? She left the remaining clothes in the basket and walked toward him, noting the package in his hands and the unusual expression on his face. Part anticipation, part nervousness, as if he was about to do something that might be rejected. I had some business in town today, he began, then seemed to lose his words. He held out the package, wrapped in brown paper and tied with simple string. I thought you might like this. Della took the package with hands that trembled slightly, surprised by the weight of it and by the gesture itself. No one had given her a gift since her grandmother's death, and she found herself almost afraid to open it, as if the contents might disappear if she looked too closely. But Gage was watching her with such careful attention that she couldn't delay. She untied the string and folded back the paper to reveal the most beautiful dress she'd ever seen. Deep blue wool with tiny pearl buttons and delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. It was simple but elegant, the kind of dress a respectable woman might wear to church or social occasions, the kind of dress that said the wearer was valued and cared for. Gage, she whispered, her voice catching with emotion. I can't accept this. It's too much. Mrs. Henderson at the dry goods store said it was the right size. She remembered you from when you lived in town. He shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncertain of her reaction. You've been working so hard, managing everything. Around here, thought you deserved something nice. The kindness of the gesture overwhelmed her completely. Here was someone who'd noticed her efforts, who'd thought about her comfort and happiness, who'd seen her as worthy of something beautiful. She pressed the dress to her chest, feeling tears stream down her cheeks despite her efforts to maintain composure. No one has ever, she began, then stopped, unable to finish the sentence without breaking down entirely. No one's ever given you a dress. Gage's voice was gentle, but she could hear the anger underneath. Not at her, but at the people who'd failed to see her worth. No one's ever given me anything that said they thought I was worth caring about, she managed to say. Something changed in Gage's face at those words, a softening that made him look less like the intimidating figure of reputation and more like the man she'd come to know through their quiet conversations and shared work. You're worth a great deal more than a dress, he said quietly, but I wanted you to have something that showed how much I value what you've brought to this place. The pause before value hadn't gone unnoticed, and Della found herself wondering what word he'd originally intended to use. But before she could examine that thought too closely, he was speaking again. There's something else. News from town. His expression grew serious. The Miller Ranch was hit 2 nights ago. Lost 30 head of cattle and a prize bull. The rustlers are getting bolder. The news sent a chill through Della that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Anyone hurt? No. But only because Miller and his sons were in town for supplies. If they'd been home, there might have been trouble. Gage's jaw tightened with determination. The gang is working their way through the valley, hitting the isolated ranches. We're probably next on their list. What do we do? The fact that she'd said "we" without hesitation seemed to register with Gage, and his expression softened again. We prepare. I've got rifles, ammunition, and I know this land better than any stranger could. If they come here, they'll find us ready. That afternoon, Gage began Della's education in frontier defense with the methodical thoroughness he brought to everything. He taught her to load and fire the rifle he'd set aside for her use, patiently correcting her stance and aim until she could hit a tin can at 50 yards with reasonable consistency. "You're a natural," he said with approval after watching her. Put 3 consecutive shots into the target. Steady hands and a good eye. The praise warmed her more than it probably should have, but she'd learned to treasure any acknowledgement of her competence. "My grandmother used to say I had good hands. For detail work." She was right. He reloaded the rifle and handed it back to her. "But knowing how to shoot isn't enough if you're not prepared to use it when the time comes. These men won't hesitate to hurt you if they think it'll get them what they want." Della considered this soberly, thinking about the life she'd built. Here, the home she'd found, the man who'd shown her what it felt like to be valued. "Then they'll find out I'm not as helpless as I look." That evening, they sat on the front porch in the gathering dusk, watching the cattle settle in the near pasture and listening to the comfortable sounds of a working ranch at day's end. Della wore her new dress, and every time she caught sight of the blue fabric or felt the soft wool against her skin, she was reminded of the thoughtfulness behind the gift. "Gage," she said during one of their comfortable silences, "may I ask you something personal?" "Go ahead." "Do you ever think about what comes after? I mean, after we deal with the rustlers, after the danger passes?" She kept her eyes on the horizon, not quite brave enough to look at his face while asking, "Do you think about the future?" He was quiet for so long, she began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful, as if he was working through ideas he'd been avoiding. "Used to think the future was something that happened to other people, that I was just going through the motions until my time came." He paused, then added more quietly, "Lately I've been wondering if maybe that's not the only way to look at it. What changed your mind?" Another long silence, and when she finally risked a glance at his face, she found him looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Company," he said simply. "Amazing how different everything looks when there's someone else to consider." The words hung between them, loaded with possibilities neither seemed quite ready to examine directly. But the understanding was there, growing stronger each day. They were becoming something more than employer and employee, something deeper than mere companionship. "The rustlers will come soon," Gage continued, his tone growing practical again. "Could be tomorrow, could be next week. But when they do, I want you to know that whatever happens, these past weeks have been the closest thing to happiness I've known in 3 years. Della felt her heart clench with a mixture of joy and terror. Here was a man who'd learned to value her presence, who'd given her the first beautiful thing she'd ever owned, who was preparing to fight to protect what they'd built together. But he was also a man preparing for battle, speaking with the careful finality of someone who wasn't certain he'd survive to see what came after. "Nothing's going to happen to you," she said fiercely, surprising them both with her vehemence. "I won't let it." Gage smiled at that, a real smile, warm and genuine. "Caroline used to say the same thing, like she could personally hold back death through sheer determination." "Maybe she couldn't," Della said, standing and moving to rest her hand on his shoulder. "But I can shoot a rifle, and I'm not going anywhere." Looking up at her in the twilight, with her hand warm on his shoulder and her eyes bright with determination, Gage Morrison finally began to believe that maybe, just maybe, The future might hold something worth fighting for after all. But first, they'd have to survive the fight. The morning dawned grey and cold, with clouds hanging low over the mountains like smoke from distant fires. Della had been restless all night, troubled by dreams she couldn't quite remember, but that left her with a lingering sense of unease. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs to find that Gage had already left for his morning rounds. Unusual, since he typically waited to share breakfast with her. She prepared coffee and set about making biscuits, falling into the comforting routine of kitchen work while trying to shake off the previous night's unsettled feelings. It was while reaching for flour on a high shelf that her elbow knocked against a loose board in the pantry wall. The board shifted, revealing a hidden space behind it that she'd never noticed before. Curiosity overcame caution. Della worked the board completely free and reached into the space, her fingers finding what felt like a leather portfolio tied with string. She pulled it out carefully, noting its weight and the careful way it had been concealed. This wasn't something that had been forgotten. This was something hidden with deliberate intent. She carried the portfolio to the kitchen table and untied the string with hands that trembled slightly. Inside were papers, documents of various kinds, but it was the item on top that made her breath catch in her throat. A yellowed wanted poster bearing a familiar face. Wanted, dead or alive. Gabriel Stone, U.S. Marshal, for the murders of Frank Delaney, Miguel Santos, and James Wheeler. Reward $5,000. The photograph was unmistakably Gage, though taken several years ago when his face had been leaner and his eyes less haunted. But it was the name that sent shockwaves through her understanding of everything she thought she knew. Gabriel Stone, not Gage Morrison. A lawman, not a simple rancher. And according to this poster, a wanted murderer with a substantial price. On his head, her hands shaking, Della examined the other documents. There was a marshal's badge wrapped in cloth, a letter of commendation from the territorial governor, and most damning of all, newspaper clippings detailing the deaths of the 3 men named on the poster. All 3 had been known criminals, rustlers, murderers, men who'd terrorized frontier communities with impunity. All 3 had died in what the papers called questionable circumstances, while in Marshal Stone's custody. The final document was a handwritten letter, the ink faded but still. Readable. My dearest Gabriel, by the time you read this, Thomas and I will be dead. The fever has taken hold, and I know we won't recover. I need you to understand that what happened with those men wasn't your fault. They came after our family because of your badge, because you were the only lawman brave enough to stand up to them. You did what you had to do to protect innocent people. Don't let their deaths be your life sentence. Don't let guilt make you forget the good man you are. There's still so much good you can do in this world. Live, my love. Find a way to be happy again. Your Caroline. Della sank into a chair, her mind reeling as pieces of the puzzle fell into place with devastating clarity. Gabriel, hadn't simply lost his family to random fever. They'd been targets, marked for death by associates of the men he'd killed in the line of duty. He'd staged his own death, taken a new identity, and retreated to this isolated ranch not just from grief, but from the very real danger that his past continued to represent. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her heart leap into her throat. She quickly gathered the documents, but there was no time to return them to their hiding place before the front door opened, and Gabriel, stepped inside. He took one look at her face, then at the papers scattered across the table, and went completely still. For a moment they stared at each other across a chasm of revealed secrets and uncertain futures. "How long have you known?" he asked finally, his voice carefully controlled. "About 5 minutes." Della's own voice was steadier than she'd expected. "Gabriel Stone, U.S. Marshal, former Marshal, officially dead these past 3 years." He moved slowly to the table, his eyes never leaving her face. "Are you afraid of me now?" The question cut through her shock and confusion, focusing her attention on what really mattered. Was she afraid of this man who'd shown her nothing but kindness and respect, who'd defended her to her own parents, given her beautiful gifts, and taught her to value herself, who'd shared his deepest grief and trusted her with his home and his heart? "No," she said firmly, "I'm not afraid of you, but I need to understand." Gabriel sank into the chair across from her, suddenly looking every one of his years and more. Those men on the poster, they weren't innocent victims. They were part of a gang that had been terrorizing settlements across 3 territories, raping, murdering, stealing everything they could carry. The law couldn't touch them because they had judges and sheriffs in their pockets. So you took justice into your own hands. I tried to arrest them legally multiple times, but they kept getting released, kept walking free to hurt more people. Finally, I had enough. I tracked them down and gave them a choice: leave the territory permanently or face the consequences. His hands clenched into fists on the table. They chose to fight instead. And you won, I won, but their associates swore revenge. They came after Caroline and Thomas to get to me. His voice broke slightly. My family died because I tried to protect other families. The fever was real, but they brought it to my house deliberately. Infected blankets left where Caroline would find them and bring them inside. The cruelty of it stole Della's breath. To use disease as a weapon, to target innocent family members, it was evil beyond her comprehension. So you became Gage Morrison, had to disappear. Had to let Gabriel Stone die so they'd stop hunting him. Thought if I stayed isolated, kept to myself, maybe I could just fade into nothing. He looked up at her with eyes full of pain and regret. But then you came here, and for the first time in 3 years, I remembered what it felt like to have a reason to keep living. The admission hung between them, loaded with implications that made Della's heart race. But before she could respond, another realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. "The rustlers," she whispered. "The men who've been scouting. The ranch. They're not ordinary cattle thieves, are they?" Gabriel's face went pale. "I was hoping I was wrong about that. Hoping it was just coincidence. But after seeing those 3 last week, taking such careful inventory of everything here," he stood abruptly, moving to the window to scan the horizon. "I think they've found me." "Found Gabriel Stone, you mean?" "Yes, which means the danger I've been trying to avoid has followed me here, and now it's threatening you too." He turned back to face her, his expression anguished. "Della, you have to leave. Today. I'll take you back to town. Make sure you're safe." "No." The word came out with more force than she'd intended, but she didn't soften it. "I'm not leaving. You to face this alone. You don't understand the kind of men we're dealing with. They don't just kill, they take pleasure in causing pain. If they get their hands on you, then we make sure they don't." Della stood and faced him across the kitchen table, her chin raised with determination. "You said yourself I'm a good shot. I'm not some helpless girl who needs protection. I'm a woman who's found her home and isn't giving it up without a fight." Gabriel stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. "You realize what you're saying? You'd be willing to risk your life to help a man who's been lying to you since the day you met? You didn't lie about the things that matter. You didn't lie about being kind or lonely or capable of love. You didn't lie about seeing value in me when no one else could." She moved around the table to stand before him, close enough to see the conflict warring in his eyes. Gabriel Stone was a good man who tried to protect innocent people. Gage Morrison is a good man who saved me from a life of misery and showed me what it means to be valued. Same man, same heart, same honor. For a moment, Gabriel looked as if he might argue further. Then his expression shifted, hardening into something that reminded her powerfully of the determined lawman he'd once been. "In that case," he said quietly, "we'd better make sure we're ready when they come. Because they will come, Della. And when they do, they're going to find out that Gabriel Stone isn't as dead as they thought." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard as Gabriel methodically checked every weapon in his possession. His marshal's badge lay on the kitchen table beside a collection of rifles, pistols, and ammunition, the tools of both his past and present lives, arranged with military precision. Della watched him work, noting how his movements had changed since the morning's revelations. The careful rancher was gone, replaced by something harder and more focused, a lawman preparing for the fight of his life. "They'll come at night," Gabriel said without looking up from cleaning his rifle. "These men prefer darkness for their work, gives them advantages they wouldn't have in daylight." "How many?" Della asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "Based on what I saw when they scouted us, probably 6 or 7, maybe more." He set the rifle aside and picked up another, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd performed this ritual many times before. "They'll try to surround the house, cut off escape routes, standard tactics for this kind of operation." Della absorbed this information while continuing her own preparations. She'd spent the morning moving supplies to strategic locations around the house, ammunition, medical supplies, food and water, in case they faced a prolonged siege. Now she was preparing what might be their last peaceful meal together, though neither of them had much appetite. "Gabriel," she said carefully, testing out his real name on her tongue. It felt strange, after weeks of thinking of him as Gage, but somehow more honest. "Tell me about the men we're facing. I need to know what they're capable of." He paused in his work, his face growing grim. "The leader is probably Cutter Donovan, brother of one of the men I killed. He's smart, patient, and completely without conscience. The others will be hired guns, men who kill for money and enjoy their work." Gabriel's jaw tightened. "Donovan won't be satisfied with just killing me quickly. He'll want to make me suffer first, and he'll use anyone he can to do it." The implication was clear. They would target her to get to him. Della felt a chill of fear but pushed it aside. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. What about help? Are there other ranchers nearby who might too far away to reach? "In time, even if I could get word to them." Gabriel shook his head. "We're on our own, just like they planned it." As evening approached, they worked together to fortify their position. Gabriel nailed thick boards over most of the windows, leaving only small gaps to shoot through. They moved the furniture to create barriers and positioned spare ammunition at strategic points throughout the house. Every action was deliberate, purposeful, the preparation of people who understood that their lives would depend on these details. "There's one more thing," Gabriel said as they finished their preparations. He went to his desk and pulled out a folded document, officially stamped and sealed. "The deed to this ranch. I'm signing it over to you." "Gabriel, no, I can't." "Yes, you can." He was already writing her name in careful script. "If something happens to me tonight, I want to know you'll have a home, a place that's truly yours, where no one can make you feel unwanted ever again." Della felt tears sting her eyes as she watched him complete the transfer. Here was a man facing possible death, and his concern was for her future security. The gesture represented more than legal protection. It was a declaration of how completely he'd come to value her place in his life. "Nothing's going to happen to you," she said fiercely, echoing their conversation from weeks earlier. "Maybe not, but if it does, I want you to know that these past months have been the happiest of my life. Since Caroline and Thomas died, you brought light back into a dark place, Della. You made me remember what it felt like to hope." Before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses cut through the evening air. They both froze, listening intently. Multiple riders, moving carefully, but not trying to conceal their approach entirely. This wasn't a social call or legitimate business. This was the arrival of men confident in their superior numbers and firepower. Gabriel moved to the window and peered through one of the shooting gaps. 7 of them, spread out in a line blocking the road. "They want us to know they're here." "What do they want?" Della asked, though she suspected she already knew. "To talk first. Make demands. Offer terms they have no intention of honoring. It's all part of the game for men like Donovan. They enjoy the fear as much as the violence, a voice called out from the gathering darkness, carrying clearly across the ranch yard. Gabriel Stone, we know you're in there. Time to settle accounts. Gabriel's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he checked his weapons one final time and positioned himself at the window where he'd have the best field of fire. Stone, the voice called again, louder and more demanding. 3 years we've been hunting you. 3 years of following false leads and cold trails. But we found you now, and we're here to collect what you owe. What I owe, Gabriel finally called back, his voice carrying the authority he'd once wielded as a marshal. I owe nothing to murderers and thieves. You killed my brother, you bastard, shot him down in cold blood. Your brother died because he chose to draw on a lawman rather than face justice for his crimes. Same choice I'm offering you now. Ride away and live, or stay and face the consequences. Harsh laughter echoed across the yard. Big words from a dead man. We've got you surrounded, Stone. No way out this time. Gabriel glanced at Della, his expression serious but not desperate. They'll try to rush us soon. When the shooting starts, stay low and keep moving. Don't make yourself an easy target. What about you? I'll do what I've always done. Protect the innocent and face down the guilty. He reached out and touched her hand briefly. Whatever happens, I want you to know that I love you. I should have said it before, but I was afraid. Afraid of losing someone else I cared about. The words hit Della like physical blows, filling her with joy and terror in equal measure. Here was the declaration she'd hardly dared hope for, spoken in the shadow of potential death. I love you too, she whispered, which is why we're both going to survive this. Another shout came from outside, closer this time. Last chance, Stone! Send out the woman and we'll make your death quick, over my dead body. Gabriel roared back, and Della heard the fury of a man who'd lost one family to these monsters and wouldn't lose another. That can be arranged, came the reply, followed by the sound of men moving into position around the house. Gabriel cocked his rifle and settled into his firing position. They're done talking. Here they come. Della moved to her own assigned window, her hands steady on the rifle Gabriel had taught her to use. Outside, shadows moved in the darkness, men closing in on what they thought would be easy prey. But they were about to discover that Gabriel Stone, U.S. Marshal, wasn't as easy to kill as they'd assumed, and they were about to learn that Della Mae Hutchins, the woman they dismissed as worthless, had found something worth fighting for and wouldn't give it up without a battle that would be remembered for generations. The first gunshot split the night air like thunder, and the war for their future began. The first shots came from 3 directions at once, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like deadly fireflies. Gabriel's rifle answered immediately, his shot precise and devastating. One of the shadows stumbled and fell, but the others pressed forward with the determination of men who'd come too far to retreat. Della's heart hammered against her ribs as she sighted down her rifle barrel, looking for targets in the chaos of moving shadows and gun smoke. Her first shot went wide, but her second found its mark, dropping a man who'd been trying to circle toward the back door. Well done, Gabriel called out, pride evident in his voice, even in the midst of battle. Keep them pinned down. Glass shattered, as a bullet found one of the unboarded windows, sending shards across the floor. Della stayed low, moving from her position to another window, as Gabriel had taught her, never staying in one place long enough to become an easy target. From outside came Cutter Donovan's voice, furious now rather than mocking. Burn them out! They can't shoot what they can't see! The smell of smoke reached Della's nostrils, and her stomach clenched with new fear. Fire was the one thing they hadn't prepared for, the one attack that could force them into the open regardless of their defensive preparations. Gabriel must have smelled it too, because he abandoned his window position and moved toward the back of the house. They're trying to light the barn, he said grimly. If it catches, the wind will carry sparks to the house. More gunshots erupted from the front yard, forcing Della to duck as bullets splintered the wooden walls around her position. But through her window, she could see orange flames beginning to lick at the barn's walls. That's when she heard the sound that chilled her blood. Horses approaching from the east, coming fast. More of Donovan's men, arriving to tip the balance even further against them. But as the riders came into view, illuminated by the growing firelight, Della realized something was wrong with her assumption. These weren't more attackers. They were her parents and the sheriff from Bitterwell, drawn by the smoke and gunfire that could be seen for miles in the clear night air. What in hell? Sheriff Talbot's voice carried across the battlefield as he took in the scene of organized violence surrounding what should have been a peaceful ranch house. The unexpected arrival threw Donovan's men into confusion. They'd planned for an isolated attack against two people, not a situation where witnesses and potential law enforcement might complicate their work. "Della!" Her mother's voice shrieked across the darkness. "Della, where are you?" For the first time in her life, Della heard genuine fear for her welfare in Cordelia's voice. The irony was almost overwhelming. Her parents had spent years making her feel unwanted, then sold her to a stranger, and now they were riding into gunfire to find her. "I'm here, Mama," she called back, surprised by how good it felt to know that someone was worried about her safety. Gabriel appeared at her side, his face grim with new concerns. "This complicates everything. If your parents get caught in the crossfire—" "Sheriff!" Della called out. "The men shooting at us are wanted. Criminals, Cutter Donovan and his gang!" Sheriff Talbot's training kicked in immediately. She could hear him shouting orders to Vernon and Cordelia to take cover, then demanding that Donovan's men throw down their weapons and surrender. The response was a volley of gunfire that forced the sheriff to dive for cover behind his horse. But now the odds had shifted. Instead of 7 against 2, it was 7 against 5, and one of those 5 was a sworn lawman with legal authority. "Damn you, Stone!" Donovan's voice was ragged with fury. "This was supposed to be simple. Nothing about justice is simple," Gabriel shouted back. "But it's still justice." The battle resumed with new intensity, but now Della could see that Donovan's men were caught between two forces. Gabriel and herself held the house, while the sheriff and her parents, armed with the rifles they'd brought from town, controlled the area near the road. Della's next shot caught a man trying to circle toward the sheriff's position, spinning him around and sending him to the ground. Her grandmother's ring caught the firelight as she worked the rifle's action, and she found herself drawing strength from that simple piece of jewelry. A reminder of the woman who taught her that she was worth more than others believed. "You're magnificent," Gabriel said, appearing beside her to reload his weapon. Blood streaked his forehead from a grazing bullet, but his eyes were bright with fierce pride as he watched her handle herself in battle. "They picked the wrong woman to threaten," Della replied, sighting down her barrel at another target. "And they definitely picked the wrong man to hunt." The sound of approaching hoofbeats came from the west now. More riders arriving, but these wore badges and carried themselves with the authority of law enforcement. Word had somehow reached other settlements, and help was arriving in the form of a federal marshal and 3 deputies. Cutter Donovan must have realized his situation had become hopeless, because his voice cut through the gunfire with desperate fury. "If I can't have you, Stone, I'll make sure you suffer first. The woman dies tonight." Della saw him moving through the smoke and firelight, heading directly for the house with murder in his eyes and a gun in each hand. This was it, the moment when everything they'd fought to build together would be decided by who was faster, more accurate, more determined to protect what they loved. Time seemed to slow as she raised her rifle, knowing that missing this shot would mean losing everything that mattered. Della's finger found the trigger as Cutter Donovan burst through the smoke, his face twisted with rage and grief for his dead brother. Her shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around, but not stopping his advance. Gabriel's rifle boomed beside her, and Donovan stumbled, clutching his side. But still he came forward with the desperate fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. "You killed him," Donovan screamed, raising his pistol toward Della. "You killed my brother, and now I'll—" Gabriel threw himself between them just as Donovan fired. The bullet meant for Della caught Gabriel in the chest, sending him crashing to the floor with a grunt of pain and surprise. But even as he fell, his own shot found its mark, and Cutter Donovan pitched backward into the darkness, his weapon clattering across the wooden floor. Gabriel! Della dropped to her knees beside him, her hands immediately pressing against the wound in his chest. Blood seeped between her fingers, warm and frighteningly abundant. "Stay with me, don't you dare leave me now." Outside, the remaining gunfire was sporadic and brief. With their leader down and faced with overwhelming odds from multiple directions, Donovan's surviving men were surrendering or fleeing into the night. The federal marshal's voice rang out with authority, organizing the capture of those who remained. Gabriel's eyes found hers, and despite the pain etched across his features, he managed a weak smile. "Did we win?" "We won." Tears streamed down Della's face as she maintained pressure on his wound. "The bad men are gone, and you're going to be fine. You have to be fine." "Della May!" Her mother's voice preceded her arrival in the doorway, Cordelia's, face pale with shock as she took in the scene of violence and bloodshed. For a moment, mother and daughter stared at each other across the space that had always existed between them. "Mama," Della said simply, not moving from Gabriel's side. Sheriff Talbot appeared behind Cordelia, followed by Vernon, whose own face was white with the realization of how close he'd come to losing the daughter he'd never properly valued. "How bad is he hit?" the sheriff asked, kneeling beside Della to examine Gabriel's wound. "Bad, but not fatal if we can stop the bleeding and get him proper care." Talbot's experience with frontier violence showed in his quick assessment. "Bullet went clean through, missed the lung. He's lucky, or stubborn," Gabriel managed to say, his voice weak but steady. "Too stubborn to die when I finally found something to live for." The federal marshal entered the house, his badge gleaming in the lamplight as he surveyed the scene. Della recognized him as Marshal William Hayes, a man whose reputation for honesty and competence was known throughout the territory. "Gabriel Stone," Hayes said, his voice carrying both respect and concern. "Heard you were dead. Was hoping to stay that way until tonight," Gabriel replied. "Circumstances changed." "I can see that." Hayes glanced at Della, taking in her rifle, her bloodied hands, and her fierce protective stance over the wounded man. "Ma'am, I understand you played a significant role in tonight's events." "I protected my home," Della said simply, "and the man I love." Hayes nodded approvingly. "From what I can see, you did both admirably." He turned back to Gabriel. "There's been developments since your supposed death, Stone. The territorial governor has reviewed your case, along with new evidence about the crimes committed by the Delaney gang. Your actions have been officially classified as justified use of force in the line of duty. The charges against you have been dropped." Gabriel's eyes widened with surprise, and something that looked like hope. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying Gabriel. Stone is no longer a wanted man. You're free to reclaim your identity and your badge, if you choose to." Hayes paused, then added with a slight smile, "Though I suspect you might have found a new calling out here." As if summoned by those words, Cordelia stepped forward, her usual sharp composure replaced by something softer and more uncertain. "Della," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology. Many apologies." Della looked up at her mother, seeing vulnerability in Cordelia's face that she'd never noticed before. "Mama, I was wrong about you. Wrong about your worth. Wrong about what you were capable of. Wrong about everything." Cordelia's voice broke slightly. "When I heard those gunshots, when I thought you might be hurt or—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Vernon stepped up beside his wife, his own face reflecting similar realization. "We came to take you home, but I can see that you already are home." Della felt her throat tighten with emotion. Here was the recognition she'd craved her entire life, offered freely at the moment when she no longer needed it for her sense of self-worth. "You raised a remarkable woman," Gabriel said to her parents, his voice growing stronger despite his wound. "Strong, brave, capable of more than any of us imagined. "We didn't raise her," Vernon replied with painful honesty. "We just failed to break her spirit completely. What she became despite us, not because of us." Marshal Hayes cleared his throat, reminding them that official business remained. "There will be paperwork, reports to file, testimony required. But for tonight, I think we've all earned some rest." As the marshal organized the removal of Donovan's body and the securing of his surviving associates, Della continued to tend Gabriel's wound with gentle efficiency. The bleeding had slowed, and his color was improving, good signs that suggested Sheriff Talbot's assessment had been correct. "So, what happens now?" Della asked as the immediate crisis finally began to subside. Gabriel reached up to touch her, face with a hand that shook only slightly. "Now we start the rest of our lives. Together, if you'll have a former lawman who's probably too old and too stubborn for his own good." "I'll take that deal," Della replied, leaning down to kiss his forehead, "but only if you promise to be more careful about throwing yourself in front of bullets." "I promise to try," Gabriel said with a weak laugh. "Though I can't promise not. To protect the people I love." Looking around the house that had become her sanctuary, surrounded by the evidence of the battle they'd fought and won together, Della finally understood what her grandmother had meant about being worth more than others could see. Sometimes it just took the right circumstances and the right person to reveal that worth to the world. 6 months later, the spring sun painted the valley in shades of green and gold that seemed to promise endless possibilities. Della stood before the mirror in her bedroom, their bedroom now, adjusting the simple but elegant wedding dress that Mrs. Henderson had helped her select from the finest fabrics available in 3 territories. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the frightened, ashamed girl who'd left Bitter Well the previous autumn. This woman stood straight and proud, her eyes bright with confidence and joy. Her fuller figure was displayed without, apology in a dress that celebrated rather than concealed her form. Most importantly, this woman knew her own worth, not because someone else had told her, but because she'd discovered it through her own courage and choices. "You look beautiful, dear." Cordelia's voice carried none of its old sharpness as she entered the room. The past months had changed Della's mother almost as dramatically as they'd changed Della herself. Cordelia had spent those months learning to see her daughter clearly for the first time, and what she'd discovered had transformed her understanding of family, love, and redemption. "Thank you, Mama." Della turned from the mirror to embrace her mother, marveling at how natural the gesture had become. Forgiveness, she'd learned, wasn't something that happened all at once. It was a daily choice, renewed with each small kindness and genuine effort to do better. "Your father wanted me to give you this," Cordelia said, pulling a small velvet box from her pocket. Inside was a delicate gold locket that had belonged to Della's grandmother, the same grandmother whose recipe book had given her strength through the darkest times. "Grandmama's locket," Della whispered, her fingers trembling as she lifted it from the box. "I thought it was lost. Your father kept it all these years, waiting for the right moment." Cordelia's voice was soft with regret. "He should have given it to you long ago, but he was too proud to admit his mistakes. He wanted you to wear it today, as something borrowed from the past to bless your future." Della fastened the locket around her neck, feeling the weight of it like a blessing from the woman who'd first taught her that she was worthy of love. Through the window, she could see guests beginning to gather in the garden that she and Gabriel had restored together. Neighbors from surrounding ranches, townspeople from Bitter Well, and the federal marshals who'd become unexpected friends. The garden itself was a testament to second chances and new beginnings. Where neglect and grief had once choked out life, careful tending had brought forth beauty that surpassed even Caroline's original vision. Roses climbed newly built trellises, vegetables grew in neat rows that would feed their household through the coming year, and wildflowers added splashes of color that seemed to dance in the gentle breeze. "He's ready when you are," Vernon said from the doorway, his voice carrying the careful respect he'd learned to show his daughter. Gabriel, fully healed from his wounds and officially reinstated as a territorial marshal, waited in the garden, wearing his dress uniform and the smile that had become Della's favorite sight in all the world. As they made their way downstairs and through the house that had become truly theirs, Della reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The scared girl who'd been auctioned off to a stranger was gone, replaced by a woman who'd fought for her home, saved the man she loved, and learned that her worth had never depended on others' opinions. The ceremony itself was simple but perfect, conducted by the circuit preacher beneath the oak tree, where Caroline and Thomas rested peacefully. Gabriel had asked specifically for that location, wanting to honor his first family while beginning his second. As he took Della's hands in his own, she saw tears in his eyes, not of sadness, but of gratitude for the unexpected gift of love. Found twice in one lifetime, Della Mae Hutchins, he said when the preacher asked for their personal vows. You saved my life in ways I didn't even know I needed saving. You showed me that the heart can heal without forgetting, that new love doesn't diminish old love, and that sometimes the people who seem lost are simply waiting for someone to see their true value. Gabriel Stone, she replied, her voice steady and strong. You gave me the first home I ever truly had, not just a place to live, but a place to belong. You saw worth in me when I couldn't see it in myself, and you taught me that love isn't something you have to earn. It's something you choose to give and receive. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Gabriel's kiss was gentle and reverent, full of promise for all the years ahead. The assembled guests erupted in cheers and applause, but Della barely heard them. Her attention was focused entirely on the man who'd become her anchor in a storm-tossed world. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with neighbors sharing stories, children playing in the garden, and the kind of warmth that comes when a community gathers to witness joy. Mrs. Pemberton, who'd made the journey from Bitterwell despite her advanced age, sat in a place of honor near the bride and groom, beaming with the satisfaction of someone whose faith in human goodness had been vindicated. You did it, dear girl, she whispered to Della during a quiet moment. You found your place in the world. No, Della replied, looking across the garden at Gabriel as he laughed with Sheriff Talbot and Marshal Hayes. I made my place in the world. There's a difference. As the evening wound down and the last guests departed, Gabriel and Della found themselves alone on the porch where they'd shared so many conversations during their courtship. The valley spread below them in the moonlight, peaceful and prosperous, full of cattle and dreams and the promise of children who would grow up knowing they were wanted and valued. Any regrets? Gabriel asked, slipping his arm around his wife's waist. Della considered the question seriously, thinking of the painful path that had led her here. The years of shame and rejection, the terrifying night when everything had nearly been lost, the long process of learning to forgive both herself and others. None, she said finally. Every hard thing that happened brought me closer to this moment, to you, to understanding who I was meant to be. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the clear Colorado sky. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed peacefully. An owl called from the oak tree, where Caroline and Thomas rested, as if offering their blessing on this new chapter. Della touched her grandmother's locket and smiled. The girl who'd once believed she was worthless had become a woman who knew her true value. The man who'd thought his capacity for love had died with his first family had learned that the heart's ability to heal and hope was limitless. Together, they faced a future bright with possibility, secure in the knowledge that some of life's greatest treasures come disguised as its greatest challenges, and that sometimes being unwanted by the wrong people is simply the first step toward being cherished by the right ones.